Thank you, Maureen. And I'm going to talk for a bit, and maybe I'll just kill the lights when we get to that part. Hi, how y'all doing? How many of you have been to Target Field? Good, I hope it's everybody. How many of you are old enough to remember the Metrodome? Almost everybody. How about Met Stadium? I know we got a few. I was talking to you. You go back to the Millers and the Saints, the minor league teams. We're going to see all those ballparks and things like that. And so I think most of you have been able to pick up the reading list. If you didn't, you can come up, grab it afterwards. And also, an organization I like to promote. I've been in it since 1979. And it's helped me a lot with the stuff that I've done, and in fact with a lot of the information in here, just getting to know other people who are experts in certain areas. Society for American Baseball Research, or SABR. And sometimes if you hear SABR, you think, oh yeah, stat geek, huh? Well, we've got a lot of them, but we've got all types of geeks. I'm not really a stat geek, I'm more of a history geek. And we have a very active chapter, Halsey Hall. You all remember Halsey Hall? Yeah, we named it after him. Armin Peterson back there is a member. We are a group that gets together quite a bit. And on the reading list, I also have our website, and you can go and find out just upcoming information. You don't even have to be a member if you just want to join us for our every other month breakfast. Come and talk baseball, do that. And Armin, I introduced there as a member of SABR, and he is also on the reading list. We got one whole slide on Town Ball, but if you want to learn more about it, his book is listed in there, and that is the way to go. Abner Doubleday. Y'all heard of him? Okay, why do you know him? Baseball. Started baseball? Maybe? What else do anybody know him for? I love the last group when I asked that question, somebody said Civil War. That's why he's buried in Arlington Cemetery. He was a Civil War general, pretty distinguished. He was briefly commanded the Union Army's First Corps at Gettysburg on the first day of fighting there. The commander, John Reynolds, was killed, and he was then made the Corps commander, but relieved the next day, kind of like being an interim manager, you know, and do you get to keep the job or not? He didn't. And he also, and this may be mythical too, you know, you get back in history, you never know. Supposedly he was the one who fired the first shots, the first Union shots from Fort Sumter on the opening guns of the Civil War. But why do we know him with baseball? Well, that's because of the codger on the right there, a guy named Abner Graves, who was a miner out in Denver. And about 100 years ago, a group formed a committee, they said, to determine the true origins of baseball. They really didn't care what the true origins were. They just wanted to prove that baseball started in America, because it was always said that it came from other types of bat and ball games from England, and boy, that didn't sit well, that this great game that was encompassing the country at the time would have foreign origins. So this committee got any kind of evidence that it could glom onto to show that it was started in the United States. They did. And Abner Graves, who was from Cooperstown, New York, had written a letter and said that he watched Abner Doubleday lay out a diamond in Cooperstown in 1839 and create the game of baseball. Well, for a lot of reasons, that's pretty well been disproved. Abner Doubleday was at West Point at that time. Abner Graves was only 5 years old, but he became quite the celebrity. And he was later committed to a mental institution after he murdered his wife in a fit of paranoia. But in the meantime, writers, he just became one of those people the writers called and wanted to talk. And he had differing stories, and they were some good whoppers. Abner said that he played on the first baseball team at Greene College in Cooperstown in 1840, and he also let him know he'd been born in 1835. So even for a protege, I think that would have been kind of tough. That's all been kind of disproven, but Cooperstown remains, at least mythically, our national pastimes birthplace. And I don't blame the folks in the 1930s, members of the Clark family, said, gee, if this is where baseball was born, why don't we have some sort of shrine? And that's what we have, the Baseball Hall of Fame, the Baseball Museum. It's out of the way, it's not easy to get to. Some people say, too bad it's not in a bigger city where we could get to it easily. And others sort of like that whole idea of going to the Hall of Fame as a pilgrimage. And it's a beautiful little town. First time I was there, and I've been there on induction day when it's at its busiest, but my first time was in late October of 1995, and it was so peaceful and serene. I had the Hall of Fame pretty much to myself, but I spent just about as much time out wandering around. Lake Osseo was there, start of the Susquehanna River. If you're going to get there, fall is a very nice time and see the town, but definitely go to the Hall of Fame too. So what's our Cooperstown here in Minnesota? Anybody figure out where this is? Nininger? Not really a village or a town. It's been encompassed by a little larger city not far from your Hastings. If you get into Hastings, you're downtown, just head out to the west a little bit, Highway 55 past the football field. And I don't know exactly how to get there, but as you head out a little west, take a right and head towards the river, knock around, and you will see historic monuments, because this was a pretty significant community with a fellow named Ignatius Donnelly, who had a planned community there. He said it was going to be some sort of a utopia, and I guess it was a utopia because it had baseball. And this is traced back to the first team representing a city in Minnesota in 1857. What came along a few years later, Civil War, that sort of put an interruption on everything, but as in many places and in Minnesota, when the Civil War ended, baseball got going again. A lot of the towns, the big cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, Northfield, others, had baseball teams. Winona, and with anything good, it creeps into it before too long, money. So we made that creep towards professionalism through the 1870s and getting into the 1880s. And it wasn't just local players. Even before the amateur, it was popular enough to be bringing in people from elsewhere to play on some of the teams. But in 1884, that's the year that I kind of consider the first year of real professional baseball in Minnesota. There was a new, or not a new league, but it expanded into Minnesota, the Northwestern League, minor league, top flight minor league, one step away from the National League, and another league called the American Association, which are the major leagues. And there were teams in Minneapolis, St. Paul, Stillwater, and later in the season in Winona. Stillwater team was notable because it had a player, Bud Fowler. Stillwater had a lousy team. Bud Fowler was a star player, pitcher, second baseman, and he had been the first black player in organized baseball a few years earlier. And it sort of showed what the game was with regard to integration at that time. There wasn't much. I mean, there an occasional black here and there, and by the end of the 1880s, they had all been, one way or the other, systematically driven out of organized baseball. Whether there was officially ever any prohibition on them or not, there was a color barrier that, as we know, existed until Jackie Robinson broke it into the 1940s. This is the Minneapolis and St. Paul teams. That started a pretty good baseball rivalry that existed for many years, and it pretty well mirrored the rivalry between the two cities. They're both growing up, sort of emerging, trying to emerge as the dominant city. I guess Minneapolis won that battle, but in 1884, St. Paul won the baseball battle, at least if nothing else, by being still standing at the end of the season. Because this league was really unstable, and teams were folding and being replaced by other teams. That's how a team from Winona came in there as well. And meanwhile, there was one other league that had started and claimed status as a major league, the Union Association. And this was the only year of operation for the Union Association. It was like the Northwestern League. Teams coming and going. Teams would fold up and go away and then be replaced. And what happened is by September, the only two teams in the Northwestern League that hadn't folded up financially were St. Paul and Milwaukee. And the Union Association was still going with its season and invited those two teams to finish out their season in the Union Association. St. Paul did. There's their entire history in the Union Association, all of the games on the road, nothing remarkable about it other than that it was the first Major League Baseball team in Minnesota. Like I say, not really. I don't think they made a big deal out of then, but and we look back, it wasn't the Minnesota Twins, it was the St. Paul team in 1884 that at least could lay claim to Major League status. Here's some of the places they played in the 1880s. This is on the west side of St. Paul, which is actually the south side, but it's on the west bank of the Mississippi River, over by Holman Field. And you know what happens to that area when it really gets, the river gets high, it gets flooded. And this little ballpark there, wooden ballpark, that's the only picture I know of it, and it's underwater. So it was also designed by the firm of Taylor and Gilbert. Now, first of all, I don't see how something like that you even need an architectural firm to design. But the notable thing about it was that Gilbert was Cass Gilbert, who also designed the state capitol, the Woolworth building in New York, and the Supreme Court building. So there's just some notoriety of that. But that sort of epitomizes the types of ballparks that we had back at that time. Meanwhile, in Minneapolis in 1889, you can see what the ballpark is there. And if I can hit my laser pointer without advancing the slide, this is Hennepin Avenue going down towards the river. So this is First Avenue. This is 5th Street, 6th Street, and anybody want to guess what's on this site right here next to the ballpark? Target Center, the basketball arena. And this is now Butler Square. If you go in there and want to see some better pictures, big pictures, up on the Skyway level, they have some really nice pictures of this ballpark. And of course, if you just go a little farther down this way, what do we got but Target Field? So it's kind of neat that from 1889 to 1896, the Minneapolis Millers played here in a tiny little ballpark. Probably the fences were only about 250 feet, and they had some high run totals, high home run totals during that time. And see just a couple of, there aren't any great shots that really show the ballpark. One interior shot there, just see the people dressed up, a few women in the crowd there. That building there, and I don't know if anybody's really old enough to remember this one, it's the West Hotel, which is a prominent hotel for many, many years. By the 1940s, it was sort of a flop house, but going back into the 1890s, it was the convention hotel for the Republican National Convention in 1892 that was here. And then this is one that you can at least see the fences, you can see the neighborhood right outside it. This picture, like I say, is really blown up in Baker Square now, and I was able to read the scoreboard and the out-of-town scores and figure out the date of this game. I think it was Decoration Day, which is now Memorial Day. Now on the other side of the river, St. Paul got a team in the 1890s in a new league called the Western League, which was prominent because its founder, Ban Johnson, hoped to turn the Western League into a major league, and he eventually did. And he brought in his friend, Charles Comiskey, to run the team in St. Paul. Now that team moved, and guess where it moved? Yeah, and you can figure that out by the name Comiskey. It moved there before this Western League made its transformation to the Major League. And there's the ballpark that they used. It's curling, you know, this is about the only picture anybody's ever found of it. This was just north of University Avenue off Dale Street. And the Rondo Library now is there. I guess it would be just to the north of this ballpark. Some of you go back and want to admit to it, the notorious Faust Theater or something like that, if that provides you with a better landmark. And also another tiny little ballpark. Just take whatever we can get for ballpark pictures. Nice, you know, it's pretty close to the center of the city, which at the time you didn't have to go very far away to be outside the city. They couldn't play Sunday games there though. Churches and residents in the area, and that was typical of that time, and especially getting close to the center city, there'd be objections to it. So they did move into a new ballpark about a mile away called Lexington Park, and I'm going to come back to Lexington Park in a bit. They could play Sunday games there, but it was a ways out of town. Well, by the time we got into the 20th century, and they were in a different league by this time, a new minor league, but they ended up at a ballpark sort of in the heart of downtown St. Paul, and that's the Capitol. They started playing here in 1903. The Capitol was being built and was finally completed. They played here through 1909. They would play all of their games here during the week. They liked it because it was close. But then on Sunday, they'd go out about 2.5 miles, a long way out of town, but then they could play at Lexington Park. So they were back and forth. This was called the pillbox because it was so doggone small. And I can't really see where they are in here, but you can see that they have these posts. And a couple of these posts in left center and right center field marked where a ball that went over the fence would be either a double or home run. Because it was so short that by rule, if you cleared the fence down the line, it was only worth a double. If you got it out a little bit farther out and cleared the fence, then it would be a home run. But we had a great rivalry between the Millers and Saints through the 20th century. And this was a new minor league called the American Association. I mentioned that Western League that wanted to be a major league. It did become one. It became the American League. Took on major league status in 1901. Minneapolis and St. Paul were gone by that time. It was never part of the plan to keep them in the league, but a new league called the American Association, another top flight minor league, one step from the top. And the teams mostly played for most of those years at Nicollet Park in Minneapolis or Lexington Park in St. Paul. This was the guy who probably is the most prominent baseball person in Twin Cities history, Mike Kelly. And that's Kelley. And he owned and managed teams on both sides of the river. A lot of turmoil and trouble followed him, but he owned one of the other teams for most of the years from the beginning of the 20th century up until 1946, when he sold the Millers to the New York Giants, and was one of the last of the independent owners in the minor leagues. Minor leagues these days, at least, we look at the Twins farm system, things like that. That's what they are, farm systems. The teams own a whole array of minor league teams at different levels and move players up and down. The minors are there more for development purposes than anything else. Back when Mike Kelly had these teams, the teams were independent. He could control his players. He could trade them to other teams. He could sell them. He'd sell them to major league teams, which for a lot of the minor league operators back at that time was one of the ways you're going to make money. It wasn't just selling tickets at the gate or anything like that, but just being a really shrewd judge of talent and getting players and then being able to sell them to major league teams. And Mike Kelly was very good at that. Another guy who came into the league in the 1940s, Bill Veeck, talking to Mike about him. Bill Veeck, we know, is the owner of the Chicago White Sox a couple of times, but he owned the minor league team in Milwaukee, and already at that point was showing his creativity as an owner with some of the things that he pulled. And I think he and Mike Kelly were pretty good friends, fellow hustlers, as he would call it. And Bill Veeck has some colorful stories about Mike Kelly. I'm not sure if they're all true or anything like that, but if we go back and get some of Bill Veeck's earlier books, Hustler's Handbook and Veeck as in Wreck, he's got some stories from those days. Anybody ever go here in Lexington Park? You were there. Okay, Armin was there. And this was on the corner. We'll kind of get a little geography here. This is University Avenue. Going to the right is going towards St. Paul. To the left is towards Minneapolis. This is Lexington Parkway here. I don't know what year this is. That'd be a little later as we see enough of the homes being built up. There's different pictures of that area, aerial shots that you can see where it's sparsely occupied and then more and more homes coming in there. This was the Coliseum, which was a dance hall and later a roller rink that was beyond the left field fence. And that wasn't too hard a shot to hit a ball over the fence and onto the roof of that. When Roy Campanella played for the Saints, he was known for bombarding that roof. Now on the other side here, which was Keys well drilling for many years, and it's just in the last 10 years that Keys moved out of that site down off Shepherd Road in St. Paul. This was pretty tough to clear because it was 369 feet down the line. And then you also had the incline out there. Anybody remember inclines in ballparks? Crosley Field in Cincinnati had a notable one. You'd be all of a sudden running uphill. Houston, most recently with its new ballpark did that in center, but I'm told they took it out. But that was just the way some of those old ballparks were. And there's a good aerial shot. Different angle. Again, this is University Avenue down this way and Lexington Parkway up here. Right about here where that Coliseum ballroom was is a TCF Bank. If you're over there, whether you're doing your banking or not, just stop in because they have a nice display to Lexington Park there on the site. For many years, Lexington, they last played there in 1956, and a Red Owl store went in there, and they put a marker in the floor of the Red Owl store for home plate. And I used to take people in there to see it, and one day I went in there and it wasn't there. I guess in the change of management, somebody took it as a souvenir. So our local Sabre group raised money from former players and others and got a marker. And at the time, well, the place we put it, there was a CDO liquor store right about here, and we got it mounted on the wall. And in the last 10 years, they've torn just about everything down except for here where the White Castle is. And we got the plaque back, and TCF Bank was nice enough to say, yeah, we'd love to have that plaque, and we'll make a little plaza and put the plaque there and some other things. So if you're in that area, University in Lexington, just park there, and there's pictures inside the bank, and it's kind of fun because you can look at some of the pictures they have on the outside and look around and kind of see things that are familiar. I always enjoy that. Well, that was Lexington Park, which was used from 1897 to 1956, and just about the same 60-year time period, Nicollet Park in Minneapolis. How many were there? Armin again, and I envy you because I was just too young, and I talked to people who, this is right now is the corner of 31st and Nicollet that we're seeing, but it was just off Lake Street. We can't quite see Lake Street here on the left, but beyond the left field fence we have the buildings, and there's Nicollet Avenue heading south. This is still the one thing that kind of keeps a little heritage in the area. The bus terminal now, which was streetcar barns back then. And then along the third base line is Blaisdell Avenue. I think I might have a better shot of it in here too, but this was the opposite of Lexington Park, where it was a long distance to right field. Here's kind of short distance, 279 feet, and the foul line intersected about here with the grandstand, and then you had a fence out here. So it was a pretty easy shot. Hitting a home run to left field wasn't that far either, but right field was real easy. The Millers had a guy in 1933, Joe Hauser, hit 69 home runs that year, 50 of them at home. 5 years later, they had another slugger. I think I've got a picture of him. Not yet, we'll get back to that. The guy at the top left there was a manager for the Saints. And he's in the Hall of Fame now. Anybody want to guess on him? Alston. Walter Alston, very good. The Saints by the 1940s had become a farm team of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And Alston eventually went up and began managing the Brooklyn Dodgers and the Los Angeles Dodgers. But he was here with the Saints. And there he is congratulating Roy Campanella, who wasn't here for very long in 1948 because he was just too good for the league. One of the reasons that he came down here, Branch Rickey, who integrated organized baseball, Major League Baseball, and had Campanella up in 1948 with the Dodgers, but also wanted to integrate the American Association where the Millers and Saints played. Campanella spent 5 weeks here, and this is his first weekend in the Twin Cities. This is at Nicollet Park, not at Lexington, but Nicollet Park in Minneapolis, where he's just hit a home run. And a lot of great players played for the Millers and Saints. It was only, like I say, it was only a step away from the majors, and it wasn't always just young players on their way up. Back at that time, you had a lot of players who were finishing out their careers, but they weren't multimillionaires. They couldn't retire. They'd go back down the ladder the same way they came up. So people in the Twin Cities, even though we didn't have a major league team, saw a lot of both rising stars, but a lot of players they knew well from their reputations in the major leagues. One who never got the chance was Ray Dandridge. for the Millers, and that was a color barrier. By the time he came to the Millers in 1949, he was 36 years old. He'd played with the Newark Eagles in the Negro National League, played in the Mexican League. Some at that time regarded him as maybe the best third baseman in baseball, and he just never got the chance. The Giants owned the team, and they never did bring him up. He did get elected to the Hall of Fame, though, in 1987. And if anybody was at the second game of the World Series that year against St. Louis, it was Ray Dandridge who threw out the ceremonial first pitch at that game. Okay, finally I'm going to get back to, I said the Millers had another slugger in the 1930s. Who's that guy on the left? Ted Williams. And this was his last year in the minor leagues before he went up to the Boston Red Sox, and he led the league in just about everything offensively. Won the Triple Crown. He was a great hitter in any ballpark, but like Joe Hauser a few years before, he could really bombard Nicollet Avenue. Easy target for him. One of the greatest hitters ever. And then 13 years later, the guy on the right, Willie Mays. He was here. He had come through the Negro Leagues, playing for the Birmingham Black Barons, and signed with the New York Giants and went up through their farm system. And he was here only briefly, 35 games in May of 1951. He hit .477, 8 home runs in 35 games. It's still a shock, though. I mean, nowadays, you'd expect that. Somebody's hitting that well, he's going to move up. But the fans were sort of accustomed, like with Ted Williams, they had seen him for the entire season. And now the team's a farm team, and it's just lost. The local teams lost control of the players, and it was kind of a rude way to really realize that baseball in the minor leagues was different at that time. We still have a little of that in the Twin Cities now. We'll get to that later, but these are just some of the scenes of the Millers and Saints games. They played, at the time, normally 22 times during the season, and on the big holidays, Memorial Day, Labor Day, 4th of July, they'd play a doubleheader with one game in each ballpark. So they'd play somewhere in the morning and then cross town. And for whatever reason, those 4th of July games seemed to bring out the fireworks. Different things happened. And one of the great brawls occurred in 1929. And you have to look at the bottom if you want to read the headline. I'll read it for you. The morning game of the 4th of July doubleheader, a tremendous brawl broke out. A guy named Sammy Bone, who was a player for the Millers but coaching first at the time when the fight started, came out of the coaching box and landed some of the hardest punches. And Halsey Hall's story, I loved when I was researching this stuff to read Halsey Hall. He was a wonderful writer and quite colorful, but his headline said, "Sammy Bone doesn't play but gets more hits than those who do." Well, 30 years later, and by this time the Saints were out of Lexington Park playing in Midway Stadium in St. Paul, and the Millers' manager, Gene Mauch, went into the stands. St. Paul had a guy, Chuck, I always want to say Chuck or Harold, Van Avery, who was just kind of a gadfly and known for being a real irritant to the visiting teams. And let me get the name right, because there's a couple I don't have it. Okay, Chuck Van Avery, well known in St. Paul. Gene Mauch had just been passed over for the managing job of the Boston Red Sox, and Van Avery knew that this was something that would get under his skin, and he chirped at him to the point that Mauch went up into the stands. And there's a couple of people from Minneapolis who were over there for the game, and this guy, who was the Millers' public address announcer, became the Twins' public address announcer. Bob Casey was one of the people in there trying to break up that fight. Usually I think the rivalry was more between the fans and the players, but that just showed the players could get into it sometimes. All right, that's minor league baseball, the pro baseball. And something that we had then, we still have now, that's really big, is this the amateur and semi-professional baseball in Minnesota, the town teams. And I mentioned Armand has a book It's on the reading list called Town Ball, or the glory days of amateur baseball in Minnesota. And this has just got a couple of pictures. It's one slide out of 50 to represent amateur baseball. It should be more. 1937, a team representing St. Paul went to the Amateur World Series in Battle Creek, Michigan, and won it. And the guy on the right is sort of, Armin, is it fair enough to call Jack Verby sort of a later version of Moonlight Graham?
Yeah, I guess. They called him Doc Verby. He was a good pitcher and a great hitter. But he never signed with, he was recruited by the Cardinals and the Yankees. But he was a smart lad and wanted to be a doctor and figured he'd make more money as a medical doctor than playing baseball, so he turned him down.
Oh, times have changed, haven't they? But yeah, he was kind of like Doc Graham, just chose medicine over baseball, but was an outstanding baseball player. From Johnson High School, he's in the Johnson High Hall of Fame. Johnson High School in St. Paul, I mean, you go and you look at their Hall of Fame, you see tons of names that, from Wendell Anderson to Herb Brooks, and Jack Verby's in that bunch too. It's still going strong. I was talking to Mike before, and he goes down to Jordan, to the Mini-Met, just on 169, and or you go out a little to the west on Highway 12 to Delano. Go to the amateur baseball, go to the town ball. It's still strong, and you can just, not a big deal, pull up, watch a game. Some really nice, quaint little ballparks. And Armand, in his book, kind of looks a little bit more at the end of World War II, when they could start putting lights up. The material for lights was available again. They could play night games. There was more money coming in. They could bring in pitchers from elsewhere. This gets in, again, a lot of the integration that was happening in some of the smaller towns with baseball players being brought in. It's a fascinating story. It's still something that's terrific, but go experience it yourself. Just sometime this summer, you can check websites for some of the different teams and find out when they're at home, and just head out a few miles on the road and see a town ball game. I've got one slide for town ball. I've got one slide for black baseball, which isn't enough. There's a pretty good history, even though Minneapolis-St. Paul never had a team in what we call the organized Negro leagues. They had a team in the first part of the 20th century, the St. Paul Colored Gophers, that played a team from Chicago for what was called the World's Colored Championship, and had a great series with that. And the reason I've got the picture of the Harlem Globetrotter at the bottom, that's Goose Tatum. Well, he played on a St. Paul baseball team in the 1940s. He was an outstanding baseball player too. And the person at the top is the representative not only of black baseball, but women in baseball. It's Toni Stone. Field named over in St. Paul by St. Paul Central High School. She grew up in St. Paul, great athlete, played softball, baseball, and went into play in some pretty good baseball, not softball, but baseball, semi-pro leagues, and also was the first woman in the Negro leagues in the 1950s. Played with Kansas City and Indianapolis. Frank White, he's on the list. I just added him to the reading list because his book just came out. It's called They Played for the Love of the Game, Untold Stories of Black Baseball in the Twin Cities, and get that book. I've started reading it, and I've seen Frank give presentations, and in fact, next Tuesday night, he's going to be presenting at the Minnesota Historical Society, and he'll probably give other presentations. Maybe he'll come here, and if you do get the chance, first of all, get the book. If you get a chance to see Frank speak, do that. So we get into the 50s, and we started getting new ballparks. Here's one that wasn't built, and it might have changed a little bit of the history of baseball in the Twin Cities had it been built. But the Millers needed a new ballpark, and they were owned by the New York Giants, and they bought some land in St. Louis Park. So that's going towards Minneapolis on Highway 12, which is now 394. And they bought land, and where some of you go back a few years, the Cooper Theater was right about here. And now this is the whole St. Louis Park West End. They bought this land from McCarthy's Cafe, who sold it to them at a discount, thinking how great it would be to have a ballpark there, and the Giants never built. They bought this land in 1948, planning to build right away. And if they had, we might not have gotten the Twins, because we might have already gotten a team. 1953 was the first movement of Major League Baseball in 50 years when the Boston Braves moved to Milwaukee. And while every other Midwestern town perks up, we want to get a team too. And Minneapolis did, but they didn't have a ballpark. The St. Louis Browns were ready to move. And they tried to get them to come here and said, we'll build you a new ballpark. And they said, well, where can we play in the meantime? They said Parade Stadium. Yeah, it wasn't going to work. So the Browns ended up moving to Baltimore, and the following year the Philadelphia Athletics to Kansas City. If they had ever built this ballpark, which would have been big enough at least for a temporary ballpark or to be expanded, it might be that we would have ended up with the St. Louis Browns, who are now the Baltimore Orioles, or the Philadelphia Athletics, who are now the Oakland Athletics. By the time we got a new stadium built, which was out in suburban Bloomington on a cornfield, and you can see it being carved out there. And the reason is, there's plenty of parking out there. St. Louis Park would have been the same thing. The old inner city ballparks that were served well by public transportation weren't cutting it after World War II. People wanted space around it, so they went to Bloomington. And that ballpark opened in 1956. Here we get another look at it. It was the Beltway, or what's now 494, goes by, and Cedar Avenue. It had good access. And there it is, right when it opened. The Minneapolis Millers played there because by the time it opened, the Twin Cities had kind of missed that first wave of teams moving from, and then there was another little wave when the two New York teams took off, but they went all the way over us out to the West Coast. So it took a few years when the Minneapolis Millers played in this ballpark. And meanwhile, St. Paul needed a new ballpark because Lexington Park was getting pretty old, and they also, of course, they wanted to get on the major league stuff too. So they built Midway Stadium, not the same one that the Saints played in up to a year ago. It was a more elaborate stadium on the other side of Snelling Avenue. It was a single deck, but they could expand it to double deck status. And the St. Paul Saints played there for a few years, just like the Minneapolis Millers played at Met Stadium. And St. Paul hoped that it would get, to at least have some of the when a major league team finally came, we knew that was going to come, get some of the games, but that never happened there. It took a while, a lot of frustrations, but finally Calvin Griffith was able to move his Washington Senators team to Minnesota, and we really had Major League Baseball. Team he moved here wasn't very good, but it was sure on the verge of being good, which is too bad for Washington. These great young stars moving into Met Stadium, and this is in December of 1960. You can see there's not much in Bloomington. Go a little north, and there's a lot of houses in Richfield. You can see here, too, that this is a triple-deck stadium, but at that time, the grandstand stopped at both dugouts. And with the Twins coming, they expanded the first two decks of this out around to curl around into fair territory. They never did that here. They put in other bleachers and things, and they eventually built up the bleachers. And there we are. You can see that expanded grandstand up there on the right field side. My dad took this picture at a game we went to in 1963 against the White Sox. Harmon Killebrew at bat. And these were some of the young players who came here. Earl Batty, a great catcher. Camilo Pascual, known for his curveball, one of the top pitchers in the American League those first few years. Jim Cott, and on the right, Bob Allison. He was for a few years one of the mighty sluggers along there with Harmon Killebrew. Anybody remember this guy sliding into home? He was my mom's favorite player. Yeah, he was a real popular one. That's just a fantastic picture that I found down in the Twins archives. And not only is it fantastic, he looks like he's out, but if you really look close through the dust, you can see the front part of his shoe is obliterated, and you can see, oh, wait a minute, that toe is in there on the plate. The other reason I got excited finding this picture. This is the first major league game I ever went to. My folks and my grandma took my brother and me in 1962, and Vic Power stole home with Harmon Killebrew at bat. So not only a great picture just for me, it's pretty special. Tony Oliva came along and he had his first full season in 1964. He was fantastic for 8 seasons, and then a serious knee injury. His career changed after that. But people who were in the 1960s who remember the excitement of the Minnesota Twins will remember those guys like Tony Oliva, and there's Harmon. This is the picture in 1967. You can see the ball. No, that's not even the ball there. That's the little arrow. Can't see the ball. You know where it's headed? The second deck in left field. First player to ever hit one out, because by that time, we can't see it here. We'll see a picture with it in there. But they had double-decked the stands out in left field, mainly for the Minnesota Vikings.
If you go back, you might see the ball.
Let's see.
Right on the left-hand side. Below the 2 and
Oh, there. Okay, right below the pitcher. Right there.
It's too low. Too low.
That massive, tremendous, powerful swing of his, and the way those balls that he'd hit would take off, it was majestic. A ball getting into the air. You know, sometimes they say, too high, it's too high, it won't clear the fence. No, not with Harmon's home runs. Those things were too high, they were too long. They cleared the fence by a bunch. This was the first pitch of the 1965 season. My dad took this. We were out for the opener, and they were playing the New York Yankees. And the significance of that was that the Yankees, over the last 44 years, had won 29 pennants. They had won the American League pennant 5 years in a row. You just thought they're going to just keep winning pennants forever. Well, they didn't. This was a big drop-off of a year, and this was kind of the beginning of the end of the Yankee dynasty, with Jim Cott delivering the first pitch of the season. And, of course, when the Yankees dropped, who went on to win the pennant that year? Minnesota. Big year because we hosted the All-Star Game and we hosted the World Series. The most valuable player up top there is Zolio Versailles, a shortstop on the team. And there's another one of Bob Allison, which is a familiar shot. You've probably seen footage of it. A great catch that he made in the second game of the World Series against the Dodgers. They lost that series. A little disappointment, but you know that I just still remember the excitement of that year, of the All-Star Game coming here, which we knew about, and then the attitude of getting the World Series. It was a good period for Minnesota baseball through the 1960s, and it sort of fell off in the 70s. The team got not to be very good, and the Minnesota Vikings did get to be good, and football was the big thing, taking over a lot. But the Twins had Rod Carew, and he was on 2 magazine covers with Ted Williams in 1977. And the reason was that Ted Williams was the last guy in the major leagues to hit 400 in the season. And Carew was right around that 400 spot for a good chunk of the season. This terrific hitter to watch. Seemed like a magician with that bat. And so he was photographed a number of times with Ted Williams just to make that comparison. Carew didn't make it to 400, finished at 388. Also in the 70s for a while we had Bert Blyleven when he was young and brash as opposed to, before the beard. He pitched until 1976 and came back in the 80s. And this is the end of Met Stadium for baseball, 1981, because a new ballpark was being built in downtown Minneapolis. Roy Smalley about to hit the last pitch, and in the bottom shot we see him taking off. He popped out. And kind of a sad day. Took my dad there. He'd taken my first game at Met Stadium. And so he and I were there together to see the end of Met Stadium as a baseball stadium. So they moved indoors, downtown. A very functional place, just kind of like totally lacking in charm or atmosphere. But you know what's kind of cool is when I talk to people, when I can get nostalgic about Met Stadium, when the Metrodome had its last baseball game, or Twins game in 2009, there were people who felt just as sad about that, because that's where they learned baseball and grew up with baseball, and even though it just was kind of sterile and everything in there, but there were a lot of good memories too when you take these players. These guys were all on the first Metrodome team in 1982, a team that lost 102 games, but they were still together a few years later. Kent Herbeck, Frank Viola on top, Tom Brunansky to the right, and Gary Gaetti, and then joined by Kirby Puckett a couple years later. And that was the core of the team that won the World Series. In 1987, we see the pins there for the Twins and Cardinals, their opponents that year. And then they're back in it a few years later with local pitcher Jack Morris, who had a great career with Detroit. And it was one and only season in Minnesota. And without him, Twins would not have made it to the World Series, wouldn't have won it. He was the one who pitched the 10-inning shutout in the 7th game of that. And Jack is like Bert Blyleven. He's still here in town, broadcasting and all of that. A couple of, Jack Morris was from St. Paul, so are these guys. Even with his head cut off, can you figure out who that is on the right? Catcher, gear, give it away. Joe Mauer, who, like Paul Molitor on top, was from Cretin High School. And Dave Winfield, from Central High School. Winfield, and both Molitor and Winfield stars at the University of Minnesota. And both had most of their careers elsewhere, but when they came to Minnesota, they each got his 3,000th hit in a Twins uniform. And Molitor now managing the Minnesota Twins. There's a final game at the Metrodome, playoff game against the New York Yankees. And what was waiting for them on the other side of downtown, about a mile away, was Target Field. This is the first game at Target Field, and it looks like where are all the people. It was a college game. The Minnesota Gophers played there. And the Minnesota Gophers for many years were coached by Dick Siebert. They've been coached for even longer now by John Anderson. It's a little tougher for the northern schools to really be competitive, but back when Dick Siebert was the coach from 1948 to 1978, the team won 3 national championships as well. And it still really does have a strong baseball tradition over there at the U of M. Well, here we go. This team started in 1993, a new St. Paul Saints team. And I was talking before about how it used to be in the minors, that these teams weren't owned by major league teams and just used as farm systems, and players shuffled back and forth. Well, a lot of that came back with a new league that started in 1993, the Northern League, with the St. Paul Saints being its most successful team, both in terms of winning the championship, but just the success they had at the gate, and really that connection with the community. Mike Veck, one of the owners of it, Bill Veck's son, and bringing that same spirit, not just of craziness, but just of connection with the fans. And they played at a new Midway Stadium, and then along the way, occasionally they'd get a big name player, Darryl Strawberry, trying to make his way back to the majors. And on the right is J.D. Drew. He didn't want to sign with the Philadelphia Phillies when he was drafted, and they didn't allow him to go to any other team in organized baseball, but the Saints are outside of organized baseball, so he came to St. Paul and played for a while, and then the following year was drafted by a different team and signed with the St. Louis Cardinals. And Isla Borders, who pitched for them and a few other teams in there. She'd been a college pitcher too, and I think a lot of you remember seeing Isla Borders pitch and making some history with the Saints too. And this is their old ballpark, kind of crusty old, but lovable Midway Stadium. Not the same one that we showed earlier. This was another one on the other side of Snelling Avenue. And then there they are in their new ballpark. Anybody been out there? Good. Nice place. Outside of downtown St. Paul or in the lower town area. So it's just, I always try to emphasize that, we know the Twins. We've had so much other rich baseball history in the state in so many different ways, from the minor leagues to women in baseball. I barely mentioned that with Tony Stone, but we had a team in that All-American Girls League in the 1940s, the one that they made the movie out of, with the Penny Marshall movie with Madonna in it, A League of Their Own. Well, Minneapolis had a team in that in 1944. And the town teams, which are still around. And take advantage of all of the ways that there is to take advantage of baseball. A friend of mine got this out the window. And here we see Target Field there. And there's Target Center, and that means that right there is that old ballpark from the 1890s, and snake our way through, and there we get where the Metrodome was, and that new thing is going up. But yeah, we're about about a mile between those and in between another great ballpark. I'll be here as long as any of you want to, but anybody have any questions or just want to? Yes.
So I noticed in the baseball pictures that of the different stadiums, it went from a 90-degree angle in the corner of center field to the rounded. Do you know any of the history behind that and how that changed in the uniformity of that?
You mean, are you talking like Nicollet Park and some of those places? Yeah. It seemed like that's how they did it, and that was part of the charm of the really old ballparks, that you had to, here's your lot, and fit it in on how you're going to do it. So Nicollet Park, which is on a bit of a smaller lot, I guess they just took it so they could get out deep as center field as they want. But yeah, a lot of those old ballparks just had that, where it shoot off like that.
So what's the history of changing it to the round, and was there uniformity?
I don't, yeah, that's one of the great things about baseball, is that there's never really any uniformity on the playing field itself other than the diamond. And it could be different things. Wrigley Field in Chicago, I guess there maybe, and Wrigley Field in Chicago was originally more like that, but they got more bleachers in there. And so they cut down on that distance. Wrigley Field is kind of rounded. And one of the, we're making the ballparks now better than we did. We went in the 60s from baseball stadiums that could hold a football team, but not very well. Football was prominent enough that the new stadiums that were being built could accommodate both. They were really functional, but just ugly. Cookie cutter stadiums, they were called, and that's when we just got that whole round type of.
Like Candlestick.
Yep. And I'm thinking, especially three that opened in 70, 71, Philadelphia, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. You look at those and ask, which one is this? You don't know. That's what they were really saying with those cookie cutter things. And then by the 90s, both sports were so prominent that they could, both for the most part, strong-arm their communities into a stadium of their own. So they're nice stadiums. And Camden Yards in Baltimore was the first that really went back to that retro look. So instead of this ugly old thing, and they were able to incorporate really well with that old warehouse there and things like that. And other stadiums sometimes seem to be like trying too hard to do that. One interesting thing though about the Target Field is because of ballparks from 100 years ago, Wrigley Field, it wasn't like they had the clout to go push the streets out to make it as big as they wanted. The confines of the lot determine your ballpark. That's what they had to do with Target Field, isn't it? Because they were walled in on all sides. They have elevated roads on two sides of this. They've got, the parking garages, and over that, which is what the plaza is, and the stands, just beneath that, you've got a freeway on-ramp, and then you got the garbage burner on that side. So that's one of the things I like about Target Field. It wasn't that contrived. Let's see what old quirky things we can put in this. They had to do that too. It is a lot nicer when I sit at Target Field, and sometimes I'll just close my eyes and think of the Metrodome and what it was like, and open my eyes, and still I'm amazed like how much nicer. We get rain. We get a few rainouts. It's a lot nicer, and particularly with baseball. I love the old ballparks too, and if I wish I could. My dad and my mom told me about going to Nicollet Park, and I just envied them, and I envy Armin for having gone to those places. I only see them in photos or learn about them, but to actually have been at some places like that. Yes?
This would be kind of maybe off the subject a little bit, but tailgating, I've been led to believe kind of originated in the Midwest, and particularly in like Minnesota, Wisconsin. Do you know of any information on how tailgating at Major League Baseball started?
Well, it got going more with football. I certainly remember it with the Vikings. And I suppose a lot of that was in the 50s and into the 60s, where the venues of the ballparks changed from confined areas to those parking, not just a little adjacent parking lot, but the big parking lot surrounding it. And it became popular with the Vikings, and it wouldn't surprise me Milwaukee had a lot to do with that with baseball. my friends and I went out to gone out in the Twins when it just absolutely wasn't cool to go to baseball games in the 70s. You know, the Vikings were the hot thing and football was cooler. And we'd go out there with a grill and, you know, just stand out like oddballs at a Twins game with a little grill to do that. And eventually that became popular now. So no, I'm not really sure on who the first is, but I'd say it probably had to get going at the time that whole movement was on, where you'd put a ballpark with some area around it so you could have a big parking lot. And whoever really got the idea to get it going first, I'm not sure. Nowadays, tailgatings, you know, they're back more downtown, and that's been the thing in the news lately on where they're going to tailgate for the Vikings. So you might have to tailgate and walk 15 minutes. Anybody remember the Kicks? Oh boy, how about tailgating, huh? Anybody ever get loaded out at the ballpark back then? I think the city of Bloomington had to pass an ordinance that required the people to actually go into the game. Well, one of the things was they had free parking out there. So, I don't know, here's a nice place to go cook and drink in the asphalt parking lot, but that's where the party zone was. So, yeah, Vikings, I just remember, become pretty famous for it.
I think there was a long tradition in college football tailgating.
Oh, there was, okay.
That came from, you know, big density for northwestern area in Minnesota were all in kind of smaller communities, and they had traditions going back into the 20s.
And you know, people who remember Met Stadium, or with the Saints at the old Midway Stadium where the ballpark was right there. You know, so you do your grilling and everything, and you could walk into the game. And now they're talking about, for Viking fans, well, it's just not one big lot around it. And thanks for coming. But you know, even the Gophers now, if you go to Gopher games, you'll see a lot of those lots. And it's not like right next door anymore, but it still does seem to be pretty popular. And I'd figure Viking fans would find a way to figure it out on how to park and how to get into the games. Yes?
When did the Twin Cities, Minneapolis, St. Paul, start putting money into supporting the baseball?
When did the Twin Cities start putting money into supporting baseball? I would say in the 50s, when they were trying to get the Twins and when they discovered that they were going to have to build a new stadium.
So prior to that, was it independent money, capital money?
Yeah, when that ballpark that I showed that never got built on St. Louis Park, the New York Giants would have paid for that. I don't think it was anybody coming and saying, here, do this for us. And then a few years later, but part of it was that the Twin Cities have a pretty strong tradition of civic, business, government working together. And there was a group called the Minneapolis Minutemen formed for the purpose of selling the revenue bonds. And they had no trouble doing it. They raised the money. So it became, well, then the commission was formed that would operate it. So it was public. So the history on that at least goes back. At that time, you're building a ballpark that's entirely revenue bonds, or which actually the Metrodome for the most part was too, but it was by that time a lot more controversial. And it was seen as such a good civic need. And the thought to get Major League Baseball here and the need for a stadium wasn't too controversial at that point. And there may have been elsewhere. And now it's a rare exception where you don't get the public money. The NFL, in fact, I think it doesn't even allow you to say, if Ziggy Wilford even said, oh, you know, I'll pony up one of my billions and build the stadium. The NFL is not for that. They want the community participation. It's a racket. I mean, it's a much bigger money racket now.
About the 50s, that television came into being, revenue started, salaries went up.
Yeah, and then a lot of things with baseball. I think baseball is a little slow to pick up on marketing it beyond just, well, there's our team. If it's good, you'll come out and see it. Some of that happened with free agency, where baseball probably finally got the kick in the butt it needed. That you know what, we gotta do more to raise revenue. Football was probably ahead of that, and maybe the sport that really got onto it pretty early was basketball, the National Basketball Association. And you kind of see that, you know, I mean, to me, when we go out to Met Stadium, there'd be a baseball game, some organ music between innings in baseball. And now it's, it's a whole entertainment experience where baseball is kind of part of it. And I just, kind of try to watch baseball. The other sports, I'd say it's harder to ignore. The noise, just the sensory bombardment, and particularly Vikings games, it's tougher to, So they all do it. The idea, I don't know, the NFL probably doesn't have to do it. They can sell enough tickets and get enough people to watch because they're either football fans or gamblers or, combination. But the baseball has really gone that route to get people out even if they're not real big baseball fans.
It seems to me that the Lakers short sold the Lakers in the 60s, early 60s for either 15 or 25 million.
Yeah.
Somewhere in there, and what are they worth today? $1 billion?
And what he sold them for at the time, because I think he had them 5 years about after they had moved to Los Angeles, was, like a huge, and of course their move to Los Angeles, I'm sure, increased the value of that. I think a lot of the baseball teams, 10 million for some of them back then, you say? And what are they? Maybe minimum 300 million or something now. Yeah, money's in those sports. And, I rail against it too, but then I'm a hypocrite because I support it. And, it's, we all do that. If we all voted, or do baseball players make too much, we'd all vote yes. But when we kind of vote where we spend our money or where we watch advertisements and all of that, we're kind of voting in another way. There's just huge amounts of money that are in there, and clout, and that's where you see. And I'm not a big fan of. I'm not just like categorically against public money going into a stadium, but I can't say that I really like the way I see it happening either. And they can do it. How many stadiums have they built here? And yes.
Prior to the major leagues being affiliated with Minneapolis or St. Paul teams, like pre-40s, how did players get attracted to the team? Were there tryouts or were there scouts like this?
Yeah, well, see, that's a good question because it happened a lot of ways. But this was really back in the days of scouting, which is just a fascinating profession to trace back. And nowadays, scouts, because the teams draft players. If the Twins go out and see somebody, well, okay, they just put them on their list and that player's available when they are allowed to draft. And back in the old days, it would be the same thing going way back with the minor leagues. And players would normally start off there. But then how would they move up? They could be sold, traded. And they did have also a draft in there to kind of protect the players. Because what happens if you're a really good player and you're on the Millers, and you can definitely be in the major leagues, but the Millers owner is holding out on what he's going to sell you for, and you're just kind of a pawn in that. So they would have a draft where major league teams could draft players off minor league rosters and pay a set price. And the good owners might see that coming, and they might sell the players in advance of that if they could get a better price. There is some big, they talk about the salaries of players, but boy, back at that time in the 20s, some big price tags that teams were paying for players, and a lot of them didn't pan out. They later talked about that they had to get a draft because they were signing these players, and for big, $50,000 and the player wasn't any good. Well, they really hated that when the player got this much money, it didn't pay out. But they were doing it themselves, just between teams. The Yankees bought a number of players from the St. Paul Saints. Ended up with a much better deal for the Saints because these players never really panned out. But they were, of course, the same thing now. You pay a bundle of money to Korean League to get Park, and you spend more money to get them than you do to pay them. It was like that back then. The good old days of scouting, it was really the ivory hunters, the bird dogs. You didn't have a big scouting bureau that was identifying every great player anywhere. Harmon Killebrew in Idaho, and Clark Griffith got him because Senator Welker out there in Idaho, or his law partner, knew of this great, powerful kid in Payette, Idaho, and passed on the word. But just, what's that? Well, yeah, Joe Cambria was the super scout in Latin America, and particularly Cuba. And there was a Clark Griffith before Calvin, and He didn't spend too much on scouting, but he kind of invested there because he could get players out of the Caribbean pretty cheap. Because we had a lot of Latin players. I mean, by the time the Twins came here, and a lot from Cuba too. And right before the draft went in, one of the last guys signed, who was just out there for anybody to take, was Rod Carew. And he grew up, he's born in Panama and lived there, but then was in New York. He's playing in Central Park, and then he would be playing in the McCombs Dam Park, which was like right next to Yankee Stadium. If you ever got there to the old stadium, and you'd see these fields, and a Twin scout plucked him out of there, Herb Stein, right? And they brought him in the Yankee Stadium to hit, and they told him to knock it off right away. Because they didn't have any real claim on Carew. He could sign with, the Yankees come and plop some more money down, he could have signed with them. There's some good books on scouting. One called, what is it? The Kevin Corain book. Do you remember Armand, Muscle on the Dollar, I don't know, dollar sign? And it gets through the history of scouting, but especially back those scouts who, they had to go sit down and try to convince the young player to sign with them at whatever they could offer for money. It wasn't like, okay, now we draft the player and he doesn't have any other choice. Yeah, and that's kind of the way it would have worked in the minor leagues too. Yes?
You talked about the minor leagues that hope to designate themselves as a major league at some point. What was the criteria that they needed to?
Yeah, how do you just say, okay, we're a major league? Part of it is that the Western League, that league in the 1890s, they were within, I don't know if it was called the National Agreement at the time, but under what we'd call the umbrella that I just call organized baseball, which means the major league and then the minor leagues that are affiliated, that have to kind of conform to their rules. They just can't go pluck players off another team or anything like that. So when Ban Johnson made his move in 1901, it was really like an outlaw league. We're just out there on our own. But now we're signing the good players, like Napoleon Lajoie from the Philadelphia Phillies or something like that. And when you're getting top-notch players, I guess you can say, hey, we're not a minor league. Napoleon Lajoie wouldn't play in a minor league. Even look at maybe the World Hockey Association. You folks remember that? Okay, and how are they not a minor league? How are they a major league competing with the NHL? Well, they had Bobby Hull and then Gordie Howe. They still weren't as good, but the American League, this was just like open season. That reserve clause was there, but now it no longer applied to some outlaw league outside of it. And it only took a couple of years before, 2 years, in 1903, there was peace between the leagues, but now the American League was recognized by the National League and would play by the same rules as far as protecting players, protecting territories. But it's recognized, in its history as a major league starting in 1901. Yeah, it's a good, and the other one, that Union Association I talked about, the Saints played in, I don't know. That was one that later on, as historians were sorting things out, they did confer major league status on that Union Association. And they had, they had some pretty good players. It's a little iffy. You don't have to be as good as the other league to necessarily say we're not a minor league, we're a major league, and have some credibility to that. But at least for the American League, it was a successful move by Ban Johnson. Take this Western League, which was kind of Midwest, and then change the name to the American League and move teams out there to take on a national status and challenge it. It's hard to do. I tell you, the American Football League, just to switch sports, that's a pretty amazing story. They kept all their teams. These later hockey and basketball leagues that came along have 4 of their teams out of however many survived. But the AFL, and part of that was TV. The AFL had a TV contract right from the beginning. That helped. And then they got Joe Namath, too.